anytime, and my understanding was that would come in from MVP, but I can send it to you directly. And then the final one, within a month, 6 weeks, we have to get the traps, get them analyzed at the analytical lab, and get confirmation on the presence or absence of the dye. So,
thank you.
For Mr. Taylor, probably. We left something hanging a minute ago that I kind of wanted to further a little bit. I found it interesting, and I think so. As the construction aspects, I'd really like to hear from the MVP folks as to how a pipeline goes in with the workers and everything like that because of the timeline. I think that's important for how we handle the understanding of EMS, etc. So could we hear from someone with MVP on that?
We're going to have MVP speak on that after she finishes to talk about that in the parliament.
Okay, thank you.
So I identified the changes we are proposing to the 401 certification that went to public notice in July. And my next couple topic areas are primarily responses to comments and an opportunity, if the board has questions, to understand where we are with some of this. So our next topic area is wetland and stream crossings, if it's okay to proceed into that. So the Corps' Clean Water Act Section 404 permit and Virginia's water protection permit requirements apply to the same universe of activities, the dredging or filling of surface waters and wetlands. There's a slight jurisdictional difference in that the Corps, being a federal agency, has jurisdiction over waters of the United States, and DEQ's jurisdiction is over surface water, including wetlands, in Virginia. That means that for the most part, our jurisdictions line up, but under our VWP law and regulation, we have extended jurisdiction over non-tidal wetlands. But essentially, it's a parallel permitting program. For an applicant who is going to engage in the activity of dredging or filling or digging in state waters in the U.S., we utilize what's called a joint permit application here in Virginia. There's a third agency involved, the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, which has authority and ownership over the subaqueous bottoms of the Commonwealth, and that's why it's called a joint permit application, because this application aggregates the information that all three agencies need to evaluate those activities in surface waters. Let me just say up front that the Corps is currently evaluating MVP's joint permit application to determine whether the crossings that are put forth in that application are appropriate to be covered under Nationwide Permit 12. That decision has not yet been made. The flip side is, okay, let's not do the flip side yet. We, the Commonwealth, issued our 401 certification for Nationwide Permit 12 back in April of this year. That certification was appealed to court. We missed that appeal, and the appeal was withdrawn. So the question of whether or not we have adequately issued 401 certification for Nationwide 12 is a moot issue. It's come and it's gone. We went to court, we didn't end up having any hearings, but that's done. So the Commonwealth has certified the use of Nationwide 12.
Can I ask a question at this point? Sure. I went back to look at the certification of the Nationwide, and in Mr. Golden's transmittal to the Corps of the certification, it indicates that did not preempt to separately certify particular activity eligible under Nationwide 12 or to attach additional conditions or otherwise modify for purposes of the VWP activities authorized by Nationwide 12. So when you say that the issue of certification of Nationwide 12 is a common law, I'm a little confused because it seems to me that the common law explicitly reserved the opportunity to look separately at particular projects that would be authorized under Nationwide.
We did, and that's fair. I was speaking, and I apologize if I wasn't clear, that the validity of Virginia's certification of Nationwide 12 has been dispensed with. But yes, we put that language in there. In this case, though, and we spent a lot of time discussing what the requirements and the protection of Nationwide 12 provide, and really evaluated whether we thought there was a need to pull out these crossings from Nationwide 12 coverage, and we determined that we were, let's see. Can you please jump to Nationwide 12 requirements include? We determined that the protections and the conditions in Nationwide 12 were adequate to address the protections and the concerns that we have. One of the things that's kind of hard, I think, to understand is that a number of these crossings, well, first of all, we have in Virginia under erosion and sediment control for digging in a wet stream. So the flow of water has to be stopped before any equipment goes in there, before that trench is dug. For a lot of these activities, the actual in-stream construction activity is done within 24 to 48 hours. So you have blocked the flow, you come in, you build the trench, you lay the pipe and tie it on the ends, you recover it, and then you let the flow back in. And utilized and seen hundreds of stream crossings, and it's a pretty accepted standard practice. E&S applies, and we felt like Nationwide 12 gave us the protection that we needed. For example, I've highlighted some of the requirements that Nationwide 12 does impose. Coordination with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on threatened and endangered species. You know, Virginia doesn't have a state threatened and endangered species law, so the hook to protect threatened and endangered species is the federal act. The same thing with historic preservation, section 106. We don't have a prohibition, and we don't have the same as there is at the federal level. So by utilizing 12, you involve the Fish and Wildlife Service, you involve historic preservation. Requirement in 12 that the area of the crossing must be returned to pre-construction conditions, and that's one of the things I sent Dave Davis and his folks to West Virginia to take a look at. Does that really happen? Is it feasible? Is it doable? And they came back and said, yeah, it looks pretty good. The core Norfolk district has imposed additional regional conditions to 12, one of which is construction activity in waters of the Commonwealth is restricted during time of year specific to Virginia and based on the Game Department recommendations. And there's also a mitigation requirement for all permanent loss over 1/10 of an acre of wetlands or 300 linear feet of waters. There's a typo there, I apologize. And the threshold for Nationwide 12 is less than an acre of impact. And in both the Corps permit and your own VWP general permit, utility crossings are treated as single as complete projects. That's what the reg says. Each crossing is a single and complete project. So when all that was added together, we felt like we had the protection that we needed.
Let me ask another question. So these, the additional features here that you're treated in Nationwide 12, of course, would actually Preservation Act consultation occur anytime a 404 permit, general permit, or individual permit is going to apply.
And you reminded me of another point that I wanted to make clear, which is although, and I have folks from the Corps here if you have questions. Tom Walker, who's the chief of the regulatory branch, is here, and Todd Miller, who's been the project manager for this, are both here. I asked them to please come in case you had questions for the Corps. As I said, the MVP believes things qualify for coverage under Nationwide 12, but if the Corps disagrees, or if the Corps requires any of those crossings to get covered by an individual permit, then it's right back with Virginia to issue an individual VWP/401 certification for that individual 404 permit.
And just to follow up on that, it's back to Virginia in the event of a Corps decision to issue an individual permit. Does Virginia not have an independent authority under state statute to require its own general or individual permit for project activities, even if they're covered by a nationwide permit under Section 4?
Yes, we do, but we are comfortable with the requirements of Nationwide 12 and how we have seen construction crossings of wetlands and streams accomplished over the years.
Just one more aspect of this, and that is, of course, any activity subject to Section 404 under the guidelines follow a sequence that calls for avoidance, then minimization, and mitigation. And in some instances, we described how a stream crossing is also the case that where a pipeline traverses a stream is to use HDD, put the pipeline under the stream and not disturb the stream. And that may or may not, I'm not a technical expert either, so that might or might not be a suitable approach under some circumstances. I don't know whether the project is sufficiently designed for either MVP to have determined that they want to use that practice in some instances, or for the Corps to have determined they want to require that practice in some instances.
Well, in FERC's final EIS, they are requiring a horizontal directional drill under the Pig River, which was not originally proposed by the applicant. And to my best of my recollection, that's the only HDD addition that FERC put in, and I would have to defer to MVP to explain their engineering analysis for when they do an above-ground crossing or a stream crossing, a directional drill. The other thing I want to mention is there's an odd little quirk in our VWP regulation, our VWP statute. And what the General Assembly has done over the years is they've gotten somewhat prescriptive in terms of giving us very clear legislative guidance as to what kinds of general permits we issue and what we can include and what we can't include. And it's not just in the VWP. There's a lot of that language in the concentrated animal feeding operations general permit language. But I went back in and was studying. Actually, I at one point looked at, I just did a search for utilities or something in the state water control law. And the General Assembly actually told DEQ, you must promulgate a general permit for linear utility projects. And by virtue of that permit, you cannot require a route alteration for any route that's already been approved by FERC and or the State Corporation Commission. So again, we're not talking about the application of that general permit here, but I do think it is an insight into what the General Assembly was thinking about.
If I understand the statute correctly, with Virginia Water Protection Law, if I understand it correctly, the nationwide, if the project qualifies for the nationwide 12, then that's automatically got water quality certification?
Yes, we have conditionally certified nationwide 12, and the conditions are minimal and they're not really related to this. But yes, we've issued our 401 certification for nationwide 12.
But the Corps has not yet determined
Correct.
whether or not this project
Qualifies.
qualifies. So that seems to me that we are putting the cart before the horse in terms of issuing water quality certification if we don't know if any part of that might come back.
Well, we've issued 401 certification for 12, and if projects aren't covered by 12, we'll still have to do our 401 certification for those crossings.
So, I think somebody explained a little bit about the 401 certification and one of the comments as far as really being certifying that new project will not cause water quality standards. And so it would seem to me that we would want to be looking at a water quality certification that was inclusive of the project. So if we don't yet know whether or not there are some portions that will need to have additional water quality certification, wouldn't it be better to wait until we got that information?
Mr. Chairman, as I understand section 401, there has to be a 401 certification for every federal approval for the project. So we're doing a 401 certification for the first approval now. We're looking at it. But if the Corps of Engineers come back next week or next month and say, we decided we're not going to use a nationwide 12 for this project, but we're going to require an individual permit either for the whole project or for some extreme project, we would have to come back and do another 401 certification for the Corps permit, which would be specific to the project. So either way we would do it, we would do this 401 plus potentially another 401. And there's nothing in what we would do with respect to this 401 that we couldn't take into consideration when we did the other 401. So we would be still looking at all the different factors. Am I not correct?
I believe you are, Mr. Hayes. And thank you for putting it in words a little more understandable than mine.
I think there's a third case which is the case for a nationwide 12 authorization by the Corps. Nationwide 12 has generally been granted certification, but in his transmittal to the Corps, the Commonwealth reserved its right to require an individual application or permit or certificate otherwise take action on any specific project that would otherwise be covered under any of the nationwide permits when it determines on a case-by-case basis the concerns for water quality and the aquatic environment so indicated. So
Yes.
there's the potential therefore that a nationwide permit, but the Commonwealth could determine that we would separately evaluate that and certify if conditions were denied under our state authority. Correct?
That's correct. The last mention I wanted to make in the discussion of wetland and stream crossings is that Nationwide Permit 12 requires appropriate soil erosion and sediment controls, which means that activity that takes place as those crossings are constructed. Next one, please. No, keep going. Next one. One more? Yep. Thank you. By including that requirement to utilize appropriate erosion and sediment measures, it kind of defaults right back to us, and we are in fact reviewing every one of these crossings to determine appropriate E&S. And as I mentioned, there's no construction allowed in flowing streams, and they have to utilize what are called approved bridging measures, which essentially mean you're doing the work in the dry, and as you can see, directional drilling is one of those options, and as I said, the pig is the only directional drill for this project. Okay. I am ready to move on to response to comments on the protection of water quality standards, if you all are ready to go there. And we touched on this in the last bit of the conversation, which is, and this is the concept that I have been trying to explain, and that I talked about when I briefed you on the different tools that we're utilizing back in July. But these components of reasonable assurance are demonstrated in a number of requirements which comprise the total regulatory and permit framework for this project. So as I mentioned, the requirements of the annual standards and specification program are identical to the board's general permit for discharges of stormwater for construction activities. The only reason we are not requiring this project to get coverage under that permit is because Congress exempted it from a requirement to operate under that 402 discharge permit. As an aside, the validity of your general permit for discharges of stormwater from construction activities was challenged after you promulgated that regulation, and the AG's office defended the issuance of that permit. The court found it was protective of water quality. So although the project is the requirements are identical. Interestingly enough, EPA just reissued their federal construction general permit, the 2017 permit, and its fact sheet. It goes through a fairly detailed analysis of how EPA has determined that compliance with that 2017 NIPDES permit is sufficient to satisfy Tier 2 and Tier 3 anti-degradation requirements. We traditionally rely on the technical studies and analysis of EPA. We don't have the people to do those in-depth analysis. So in the same way that we will bring you proposed criteria that EPA has developed the fact sheet and the information about, we rely on those too. And in this case, what the court has, what EPA found both in the 2017 permit and the 2016 and the 2012 permit is that the requirements and the controls of that permit won't lower water quality. And very specifically, I think what it turns on is that these are temporary construction activities. They are not permanent 402 discharges, and that E&S controls are designed to minimize the impact on water quality. The other component of reasonable assurance, I believe, is demonstrated by our issuance of the 401 water quality nationwide 12, as we just discussed.
Mr. Chairman, what is wrong with the general standard?
Well, we do not have a water quality criteria for total suspended solids. We look at turbidity as a function. We will use benthic monitoring to determine the quality of a given stream. But no, there is no, so the primary pollutant from a construction project is sediment. And we do not have an in-stream water quality standard criteria for total suspended solids or sediment.
But the general standard applies anytime.
Yes, it does.
For maintaining commercial uses and so forth. Thank you.
On the next page, discussion of why we have reasonable, what we believe demonstrates reasonable assurance. The 15 additional conditions, back one, please. The 15 additional conditions that are in the proposed 401 water quality certification. We took a look at all these programs, practices, regs, permits in place. We heard many thousands of comments about concerns and potential impacts to water quality, not necessarily potential violations of water quality standards, but I kind of took it a little bit broader and said, what do we need to do to protect water quality? And the 15 additional conditions in the proposed certification are designed to add that little bit of protection that's not otherwise covered by the permit related to crossings, by annual standards and specs, by erosion and sediment control. I believe that the comprehensive water quality monitoring that we are going to be conducting, water quality, benthics, and habitat monitoring is part of that demonstration because it will let us see what happens as the project unfolds. And then again, I mentioned before the contract that we have with the U.S. Geological Survey to perform continuous in-stream monitoring of pH, DO, water temperature, conductivity, and turbidity. And those parameters could indicate an issue. And as I mentioned before, with those continuous monitors, and we've never done anything like this before. You know, this is like really, it's expensive technology, and it is very forward-looking for us to have these continuous monitors in place. Typically, we have not been able to afford that kind of equipment, and that data is reported probably an hour or so after each reading. So I have some additional pages in case there were any questions about spill prevention and countermeasure control plan, landslide plan, blast plan. All of those documents have been developed for the FERC license, and we have incorporated them into the proposed 401 such that they are enforceable by DEQ also. I didn't know whether we wanted to run through those. I had them in there just in case there were questions. But if there are no questions on those, then I have covered my slides. There were a few things that the board had asked of the applicant, and if it is okay with you, I'd like to turn. Oh, Sandy. We have an outstanding question, which is the question about other existing monitoring stations. Thanks, Sandy.
Yes, so we do have 5 long-term stations that are within 5,000 feet of the pipeline. So these aren't narrowly focused on the pipeline, but they are in the vicinity. Those are long-term trend stations. And a couple of probabilistic stations as well, where we collect data only one time.
And you're going to add the 12 on the pipeline?
Yes, exactly. On the stream crossing. So those are targeted for this kind of activity.
So it would be safe to say you have approximately 17 in the immediate narrow watershed of the pipeline?
Right. That's correct. Yes.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'd like to follow up.
I'm sorry.
What parameters are we measuring at those 5 stations?
At the 5 stations, those are our typical parameters. So nutrients, sediment in the water column, and bacteria. So those are not benthic stations, but at the 2 probabilistic stations, we do collect fish, community, and benthics as well.
One more thing.
Yes.
What's your baseline? How long have you been doing this?
So the long-term trend stations, we've been monitoring those for 20 years.
Thank you.
So if there are no more questions for DEQ, staff, or our technical state experts, I believe that MVP has answers to some of the questions that you raised.
Maybe the questions were around karst plans and number of wells in that area.